thank you all for coming to this session called Incorporating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion into Textbooks, presented by Jessica Sarah and Paul Liu. Jessica is the Senior Developmental Editor at the University of Arizona Global Campus, where she specializes in content development for the university's custom textbook publishing team. She has more than 12 years of experience in publishing college-level digital textbooks and works closely with authors and subject matter experts to develop rigorous, inclusive, and accessible learning materials to foster student success. Paul is an adjunct lecturer, Viterbi School of Engineering, University of Southern California. His area of interest is in strategic management of technology and innovation, industrial engineering, systems engineering, project and program management, and information systems. He's authored 3 textbooks on topics of product development, project management, and operations management. Paul will transition to a senior lecturer and director of engineering management at USC in the fall. Welcome, Jessica and Paul. And so with that, we're going to start with Jessica, who has the first part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks for that nice introduction. So hi, everyone. Again, I'm Jessica. I want to thank you for joining us today. And as Laura mentioned, I am the Senior Development Editor for the College Textbook Publishing Group at the University of Arizona Global Campus, or UAGC. Over the past few years, I have been working closely with other editorial team members to establish our approach to DEI in both our publishing and editing processes. At UAGC, we consider the work of making our content diverse, equitable, and inclusive to be ongoing. But today, I just wanted to share with you some of our best practices. Great. So I'll just start with a quick overview. So I'll first be talking about establishing a common understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the form of a DEI statement that reflects your goals and values as a textbook author. Then I will focus on how to put that understanding into practice by making diversity, equity, and inclusion part of your writing, as we consider DEI in how you write, what you write about, and how you present your content. So we will jump into establishing a common understanding. So again, making sure that DEI is part of the entire textbook process begins with ensuring everyone involved in the project is on the same page in terms of DEI. So getting on that same page really starts with a common understanding of what DEI means, which can actually vary pretty widely. If you've looked at other statements, you can see that there are a lot of different ways to define these elements. One way to develop that common understanding is to establish your DEI statement with working definitions of each element of DEI. So these can be your personal definitions. They could be informed by reliable sources, or you can be worked on in partnership with your publisher. Or you can even just use your publisher's definitions if they have them. Either way, this statement really should guide your writing and best practices concerning DEI. Excuse me. I did want to highlight that I had mentioned that DEI should include working definitions. You should really be open to revising this statement based on new information and feedback. Part of DEI really is being open to considering new information and being able to adapt based on what we learn. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'd like to establish our common understanding of DEI by sharing the definitions we use in the editorial department at UAGC. So our statement begins with the following brief introduction before we define DEI. And that is that the UAGC editorial team is committed to the authentic and accurate portrayal of our diverse world. And we strive to ensure that our content fosters and promotes inclusion, equity, and belonging. So we begin with our first definition of diversity. It is a long list. Hopefully you can read it. There are a lot of things that we cover, but essentially it's the range of human experiences included but not limited to, as again, you'll see a very long list here and certainly not exhaustive. But one point about this definition I wanted to make was that a person is not categorized by only one characteristic or trait, but by multiple cumulative interconnected identities. And this really gets at the idea of intersectionality you may have heard of. Again, that every person is an accumulation of multiple experiences, And we want to avoid painting anyone with a broad brush. So our next definition is for equity, and that's the practice of ensuring equal and fair treatment, access, and opportunities for all. This requires efforts to identify and eliminate barriers that advantage some and disadvantage others. Again, another important point about this definition is to note that equity is different from the idea of equality. Equality implies that everyone should be treated the same regardless of their experiences. But equity is based on the idea that everyone has very different experiences, which puts them at different levels of access. We do tend to include this figure that you can see on the screen in our DEI statement when we give it to our authors and freelancers, just to illustrate, again, very surface level illustration of the difference between equality and equity. You can see in the image on the left, each child has been given the same access to be able to see the horse behind the bushes, but you can see that not each child has the same ability to see the horse. But on the right image, these resources have been redistributed, giving each child the same level of access to being able to see the horse. Again, very surface level illustration of the difference between equality and equity, but a very important point to keep in mind. So our next definition is inclusion. We define this as the intentional involvement and representation of all so that any individual or group feels welcomed, respected, supported, valued, and able to participate. Inclusion requires eliminating barriers that create conditions that would otherwise exclude someone's active presence and participation. And then finally, our DEI statement at UAGC includes the letter B for belonging. And we define this as the feeling of being accepted, included, respected, valued, safe, and supported. Belonging is the result of creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. So we decided to include this in our definition of DEI, or to extend this definition of DEI to better reflect the values of the university, which emphasizes fostering a sense of belonging for all students. You may have seen statements from other publishers or other institutions that use other acronyms. I've seen the use of JEDI, J-E-I-D, which adds justice to the form. And then I've also seen IDEA, which adds A for advocacy. As a publisher, we provide our statement and definitions to our authors, our reviewers, and any freelancers to ensure everyone working on the content of the book has a shared understanding of what we mean by DEIB. So for authors, those of you working with publishers, if your publisher has not provided you with their in-house definitions, it could be a good idea to ask them. Most publishers do have those definitions defined at this point. And if they don't, you can always raise the discussion. So outside of a publisher, you may want to establish a working statement just for yourself as you write. And there are a lot of resources, particularly online, that you can consult. Most publishers and companies do make their statements readily available, again, online, and you can use those to help inform your own. So now that we've established our common understanding, let's move on to apply that understanding to your writing. Again, your DEI statement should guide those decisions you make as you write, but the statement really is just the beginning. There are a number of factors that go into creating a book that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. These include more specific practical elements in terms of how you write, what you write about, and how you present your content. So, in other words, as you write, you really should consider the words that you're using, the stories and experiences that you share, and the way your content appears to your readers. So how you write includes using bias-free language, talking about the person first, and referring to people and groups using their preferred terms. Who you write about includes presenting multiple perspectives and experiences, using diverse and inclusive stories, examples, research, and so on, and being responsible with others' stories and experiences. And then finally, how you present content. You should consider all of your readers. You should use alternate formats whenever possible, and you should ensure all of your readers get comparable information. So for the remainder of my part of the presentation, we're going to focus on these three elements. So as authors, you likely have already encountered the concept of bias-free language, but just to quickly recap, or for anyone who hasn't, And when writing, you should use language that is clear, objective, and free of bias or stereotypes. And this is, again, includes, but is not limited to terms referencing gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status, and age. Your publisher's author guide or your preferred style guide will likely include a section on this topic already. And those often include recommendations for terms you can use that avoid bias in your writing. So on the slide, I have some examples of terms you can use in place of some potentially problematic terms. So instead of the elderly, you could use older adults or persons 65 years and older. Instead of Indians, Indigenous people, or Native Americans if they are tribes from America. Instead of chairman, you could use chairperson to avoid using gendered language. Again, mothering, another term that's gendered. You could use parenting or nurturing to avoid the insinuation that only mothers care for children. And then again, opposite sex versus another sex. That's a good term to use instead of, opposite sex kind of already implies a difference. So we want to make sure another sex could also avoid the insinuation that there is a binary to sex and gender. So I'll say as an editor, I actually really appreciate that a number of style guides, including the APA style guide, recommend using the singular they when the gender of a generic or hypothetical person is really irrelevant to the context. This obviously avoids gendered language, but I also find it, as a reader even, nice to avoid that cumbersome he or he/she construction, which does tend to kind of disrupt the flow of an author's writing. So next we have using person-first language. Person-first language is really kind of what it sounds like. It's putting the person first. So this approach emphasizes that we are talking about people who, again, are more than just a single descriptor or circumstance. Person-first language focuses on a person's potential rather than on factors that may be currently limiting their potential. So on the slide, again, there are some examples of person-first language. So instead of homeless person, you could use the term person experiencing homelessness. Alcoholic, a person struggling with alcohol addiction. Poor person from an underserved community. Instead of senile, you could use person with dementia. And instead of mentally challenged, you could use people with intellectual disabilities. While person-first language really is a best practice in many cases, it's important to note that this is not applicable for all groups. For example, while some disability groups advocate for person-first language, there are groups who prefer identity-first language. According to the APA Style Guide, identity-first language allows the individual to claim their disability, and it is often used as an expression of pride or cultural pride and a reclamation of a disability that once conferred a negative identity. So if you're unsure of which approach to use, either person-first or identity-first, seek guidance from a self-advocacy group or other resources specific to the people or groups that you are writing about. So similar to using person-first language, it's important to refer to the people that you're writing about using the terms for which they've expressed a preference. So this best practice I found could be actually summarized pretty well, and I feel like this is a fairly often used quote that discusses this topic, but it is: the best rule of thumb is to call people by whatever term they prefer, just as you should pronounce their personal name however they want it pronounced. If you are unsure of what to use to describe a certain group of people, just ask members of that group. So, let me just finish up that slide before I move on. But a style guide, again, might include some of these preferred terms, but it's pretty unrealistic that a single guide could cover the wide variety of people and groups in existence. So this step does take a bit more legwork. If you're unable to find a preferred term in your publisher's author guide or in your style guide, you could actually, make that effort, ask a member of that group, but it's important to find people who want to help teach you, and don't put that burden on just any person you encounter from that group. Find people in positions who want to teach this. And there's also the option, again, to consult professional and advocacy groups, many of whom address DEI-related topics, including preferred terms on their websites. And much like the rest of the work surrounding DEI best practices, creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive vocabulary is very much a work in progress. I will use an example that I recently came across when working on a general education research textbook that used the term analysis paralysis. I admit that I actually overlooked it as being a potential issue because it is such a familiar term. It is used in a lot of different books. But several of our reviewers pointed out the term as being potentially ableist. I did some research to try and see if there were any preferred terms to replace this term, but it actually came out that there really wasn't one, not a commonly used term. So in this instance, instead of being able to use and reinforce a replacement or a preferred term, we opted just to describe the phenomenon instead of using the term. And this really pointed out a lapse in some of the language we use to talk about DEI, and also just a greater need for being able to identify these kinds of terms when they come up. It's a good reminder also that the language you use to talk about DEI, just like all language, is constantly evolving. So it really should be a best practice to review and update the terms that you use often. So now that we've covered how you write, let's discuss what you write about. So while style guides and similar resources can help inform your use of preferred terms, deciding what to write about is a bit more subjective. So it's, again, pretty natural for each of us working on a book, from the author to the editor to the proofreader, to have their own lens through which they see the world. And each of our lenses is shaped by our specific cultures and lived experiences. And this is a wonderful part of being human, but unfortunately can also be a limitation to DEI. So when writing about any topic, it is important to look outside of your lens and consider who is being included. So what examples are you giving? Are they representative of our diverse world? Whose stories are being told and who is telling them? Whose research are you including or citing? Are you bringing in marginalized voices from your discipline? A part of DEI is being responsible with the experiences and stories of others. And as an author, you have this power to inform others. So that power comes with the responsibility to treat the stories and experience of others with great care. So some ways to ensure that your textbook represents the diversity of our world and is inclusive of all who experience are to, one, have a diverse review panel, including reviewers who look at each chapter specifically for DEI. At UAGC, our editorial team is in a unique position of being closely tied to a university, but your resources could be as close by as your colleagues who are more knowledgeable in certain areas and can offer feedback. If you are able to conduct a DEI review board, some questions you can include are, does the content reflect culturally diverse perspectives? And whose perspectives might be missing? Does the content uphold DEI goals of combating underrepresentation, bias, and stereotypes? If you have an art program available for your book, you might ask reviewers, does this art program reflect a variety of ethnicities, body styles, gender designation, and abilities? So I'll say representation in an art program really goes beyond diversity just for diversity's sake. For example, in medical textbooks, showing how certain diagnoses affect people of different skin colors and body types can increase those students' awareness and ability to better treat all of their future patients. I'll say at UAGC, the majority of our students are people of color, and the average student age tends to skew a bit higher than at traditional universities. So for us, it's really important that we are selecting images that help these students see themselves represented in the disciplines and careers they're pursuing. In addition to having a diverse and DEI-focused review board, you can also consider working with subject matter experts as contributors who can write about cultures and experiences with which you are less familiar. And then finally, again, you can always consult resources for writing about specific topics or experiences. So our final element of treating DEI as part of your writing process is considering who has access to your content. So making sure others are represented in your book is not enough alone to achieve DEI. All must be made to feel welcome, and barriers to their full participation should be eliminated. One of my favorite analogies about this comes from author Trudy LeBron, who wrote, "Diversity without inclusion is like throwing a party and inviting a wide variety of people to come enjoy brunch on your rooftop balcony. But when the guests arrive, some of them can't eat half the food because you didn't consider allergies or dietary restrictions. And since the building didn't have an elevator, some of the folks on your invite list couldn't get to the party because they can't access the roof." Applied to writing a textbook, this quote is really a reminder that you should consider all of your readers. Even the words that you choose can impact how accessible your book is. So for example, if your book will be accessible to students who use screen readers, you should avoid using Roman numerals. A screen reader will actually try to make those numerals into words and read them that way instead of as numbers. So when creating lists in your book, opt for numbers instead of Roman numerals. Similarly, it is also best to avoid directionals in your writing that assume sight. So words like above and below when you're referring to content. These terms will be meaningless to readers who are accessing a book via screen reader or audiobook. So some recommendations for ensuring your textbook is accessible include considering multiple formats, again, print, digital, audiobook. Use color contrast in your visuals. Avoid use of color alone to convey information. Provide alt text or alternative text for photos and figures. If you're using videos, make sure to add closed captioning. And then also, if you're going to be making your book digitally available via a screen reader, enable screen navigation so that is more accessible for students using just a keyboard instead of a keyboard and a mouse. I'll say offering your book in different formats, including print and digital and audio, maximizes who has access to your work. And then this also offers more choice to all of your readers. So I'll say at UAGC, we offer an audiobook version of our digital textbooks as an alternative for students with visual impairments. But it actually turns out that this is one of our most popular offerings among all of our students, since it gives them the ability to listen to their books on the go. A lot of our student population work at least part-time, they have families to care for, or they have other responsibilities that really require them to be pretty flexible in how they allocate their time. So this audiobook option allows them that flexibility in how, when, and where they can access their learning materials. If you plan to offer a digital version of your textbook, it's a good idea to consult the Guidance on Web Accessibility and the ADA from the U.S. Justice Department. I've actually included a link to this resource on the handout for this part of the presentation. This guidance is written more toward website compliance with ADA, but it is also a really good starting point for digital content like ebooks. So I thought I'd quickly just share some examples of some of the previous recommendations just to kind of convey their importance. So on this slide, you'll see two examples of text on a colored background. One is, hopefully you can see clearly, easier to read than the other. So it kind of exemplifies the point of color contrast being an important part of accessibility in your book. So choosing the font that's easy to read and accessible for students really makes it easier for the readers to focus on reading your words and what you've written rather than even just trying to see them at all. On this slide, I have another example of color contrast, but in this case, we see how the color choices, which are pretty easily distinguishable in the image on the right to most, or sorry, the left to most viewers, can actually become an issue for viewers that have color blindness. So to a person with red blind color blindness, the colors end up looking nearly the same or almost quite similar, as you can see in the image on the right. So the intended information that we're trying to convey via this figure wouldn't be properly conveyed to that viewer. There are a number of resources online that can help you detect and improve issues with color contrast in figures and text. And some of those are actually included in the handout as well. And then finally, the previous example also ties into the next best practice, which is to avoid using color alone to convey information. So an alternate presentation of that previous figure would be to use pattern in addition to color. So you can see in this revised image, even if you aren't able to change that color, viewers with color blindness can actually still make a distinction between France and Germany in this figure because the patterns are different. This way, all of the readers can get the information. If you're working with a publisher, it's pretty usual that these decisions will be made by the editorial team. But as an author, you can advocate for these features in your book. So I know that this is a really big topic to cover, and we've really only scratched the surface. And I know Paul will be going over this in more depth. But I would like to end my portion of the presentation with just a reminder and some encouragement that the process of writing content that upholds DEI is really iterative. It's going to be an ongoing process. No single book can solve the issue of systemic inequities, but every book can really be an opportunity for progress. So thank you guys, and I will, here we go. I'll turn it over to Paul.
All right, thank you. Paul, do you want to go ahead and get your slides up? All right.
Yes, okay. Can you hear and see the slides? Great, thank you. So I'm going to continue a little bit and talk a little bit about how maybe some of the things that we might want to think about as we incorporate DEI into technical textbooks. Now, how did this come about for me is, again, as I started writing technical textbooks and said, there's a lot of quote unquote technical stuff that you want to put into a technical book. And I said, well, I really haven't given this DEI notion much thought as I started writing these books. And now I kind of have a different perspective. So I thought about, if you're going to go do this in let's say it's a niche of technical books, what are some of the things that you may want to think about, and what is the data actually telling us? So I did a little bit of literature review. I'll share that with you, and then on the second piece there, some of the considerations, if you will, that I started thinking about in terms of what would make sense for a technical textbook. Okay, so first is the numbers, right? What's going on in the engineering discipline, or the engineering disciple, if you will, in academia, if you will. And as you can see, there's still, even though there's a huge movement, if you will, of including or opening up, if you will, right, a broader spectrum, if you will, of engineering students, there's still quite a bit of disparity, if you will. So as you can see here, from 2010-11 to 2015, there is a massive increase of non-US residents. However, the level was still relatively low. And then as you go into gender disparity, even especially for the underrepresented groups, it's actually still quite significant. So again, without boring you with words, I thought I'd just kind of summarize this and show you in a few slides what we're talking about. So as you can see here, right, even though we are starting to see, a diverse population, if you will, right, in the undergraduate level, you can still see a significant disparity in the demographics, if you will. And what's even more interesting is if you go into the master's programs in engineering, you can see that 58%, okay, of enrolled students in master's level engineering disciplines are non-US residents, meaning they come from someplace other than the US for most cases. And then you can also see still, quite a divergence, if you will. Okay. And then if you take a look at this one here, talking about percentage of engineering doctoral students, very similar, right? 58% of doctoral engineering students are classified as non-US residents. So having said that, it seems like no doubt there's needs to be a focus, if you will, of, okay, if we're going to attract more and more diversity, or we're going to bring in more of a more diverse views, we need to then focus on how we can do that, including the textbooks that we would be writing. So then my next thoughts would then say, okay, well, what is it like, right? What are we really talking about? So I looked at a few articles that was I thought was kind of interesting. The first one is titled, "Are We There Yet?" Right, and again, I won't read it in verbatim. As you can see, the Princeton graduate student attributed the decline for humanities majors due to the rise in women pursuing professional degrees and engineering degrees, which I thought was, wow, that's pretty cool, right? So you are seeing a migration, if you will, of people moving into this technical field, which I think is awesome. But if you look on the last bullet, because unfortunately, based on the analysis of professional academic journals, right, the current textbooks in business and technical communications, right, is really still focusing primarily on, I would say not a well-represented demographics, if you will, right? So, and then the next one that I looked at is talking about intellectual communications. And again, I won't read these in verbatim, but you can kind of see, the reason and the need to study culture, right? And how important that may be. Now, for me, as I looked at the first set of data, it says, well, you've got almost 60% of graduate students, right, whether at the master's level or doctoral level, they're non-US residents. And very likely, many of them may come from a different culture, may come from where English is not their primary language, it's their second language, and things of that nature. And so, well, maybe there's some thoughts or some way of thinking through, is this something that also should be considered as you're looking into, as you're into authoring technical textbooks, if you will. Okay. And then also from the same journal, right, the importance of definition. And again, as you can see, using a definition for complex terms to help students understand the topics is also very important. And how we define things is also important, and especially in cultural contexts. Okay. So one of the things that kind of give you an example of what we mean by definition. Sometimes, what we assume to be how we define things may be very different in other cultures and even in other languages. For example, in the English language, we use 1 million, right? And we have 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000. And all of those are ways that we define numbers, right? But in the Asian culture, in many Asian cultures, especially in the Chinese culture, and how they define numbers, how the Chinese define numbers, it's 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. It doesn't go any more higher than that. So if you want to represent 100,000 in Chinese, it'll be 10,000. So if you're writing in English and you say a million, and someone says, well, what's a million? Right? Oh, it's 110,000. That's how you would translate that into the Chinese language, right? So then say, oh, well, if I'm writing a textbook and I have to assume, right, that we very clearly define what is a million, what is 100,000, right? All those kind of things. Just to kind of give you an idea of how important definition is, especially in technical realms. And then lastly is, globalizing the writing studies, how textbook constructs the you, right, in the primary audience of the textbook, meaning who is really your audience and who is it that you're really writing to, like Jessica was referring to in the first part of the presentation. What is it you're writing? Who is it that you're writing to, and what do you really want them to get out of this? So that's really the some of the reviews that I looked at. Okay. So, and then I transition into, okay, if I'm going to be, making a recommendation or suggestions going forward, how I would do this and how I may want to actually incorporate more DEI into technical textbooks, then I started looking at the language, the content, the context, even images, and looking at case studies and problems that you may want to put into your textbook, and then exercises for the class, if you will, or for students. So I kind of looked at these areas here. And again, I'm going to show you some examples. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about each of them, but just to give you a flavor of what these look like, or what I think I'm coming up with. Okay. So language is, again, like I mentioned earlier, well, it is kind of important because languages and communications is nowadays, no doubt, intercultural. And, you should be gender inclusive. And it's also very important to have definitions of the language that you're using. So whomever's reading it says, I understand this to mean this. So, and Jessica had a whole bunch of listing, if you will, of the various languages. And again, you can kind of see here the terms on the left where it says oppressive terms. These are very common technical words that we're currently using now, right? Black box, a black hat, a black list, right? All of these things. And then you can see on the right-hand column, you can see the inclusive terms of, closed box, and those things. And the good news is I am starting to see people use some of the more inclusive terms on the right-hand side in many of the technical discussions that I'm seeing. So it's a slow migration, but I am seeing that migration. And going forward, I think would be good to include some of these types of some languaging, if you will, into technical textbooks. Okay, so content, right? And again, consider the reader, view it from their perspective, and it needs to make sense for them, really not for you. It needs to make sense for the person that you want, that's reading your book, if you will, and what is it that you want them to get out of your book? Okay, so one thing that I thought was pretty interesting that I found from Duke was, a centered marginalized voice, where you would look at literally from three perspectives: the materials representing the marginalized group. Are you using material that would be representative of the various groups? And in my case, I go back and look at the demographics of the people that would be reading these books and what would make sense. And then materials by the author for marginalized groups. And then here, talking about guest speakers, academic work, and those type of things, you can certainly weave that into your textbook as well. And then finally, materials by the audience, meaning, well, if you were to talk about a specific topic, what would that then mean from a different culture or from a different perspective? How would that then play out? Okay. So the content is, what is the purpose of the text and how can it be relevant, right? And how are things defined? And for example, if you take a look at this study here that was done by Harvard, you can kind of see, right, racial discrimination and face recognition technology. And if you look at this, you can kind of see, it's very interesting. You can see the various colors here. You can see that the and again, you can see the languaging here, even, right, how it's really not what I would call, right, inclusive, if you will, right? But again, this is an example, if you will, of what I mean, right? That maybe, if you had to redo this again, or if I had a chance to show this information in a textbook, would I use a different, maybe would I use a different naming convention? Would I define this in a different way? Okay, and now this one is also interesting. And again, and again, this one here again deals with what we call the design eye when we're designing something. For example, this is somebody that's designing a cockpit, if you will. And you notice it's again, in my opinion, this is not a quote unquote very inclusive. These are not what I would consider to be inclusive diagrams. And you can kind of see it's the, and sometimes we'll say, well, this is the average eye. The design eye would be, okay, I'm going to kind of cover maybe 80 to 85% of the population when I design something. But you notice that if you look at it, it's really, in my opinion, not a very diverse representation, which again, if I had a chance to design something like this or create something like this in a textbook, I may actually take a different perspective on how to do this. Okay, now imaging, just like we talked about, is definitely important, and it needs to be more than just what we call, what I call obligatory images. It needs to have meaning. Okay, So for example, this is a an image that I saw, and and the title of this online article says, well, girls who code, right? How images can shatter tech gender stereotypes. And again, when you read the article, there's no reference to this person and what this person's doing. It's just an image, right? That you would have to maybe somehow kind of infer, if you will, right? So again, as I thought about that, it says, and again, I'm not going to walk you through the history of, women in technology, but just to give you some ideas about, well, wait a minute, would it make better sense if we say, in a different way, say, not so much, using words like girls who code, right, but using more inclusive language and include people that should be recognized for their contributions, if you will, in the field of technology or in the field of engineering. So the likes of Lillian Gilbert, and again, I won't read this to you, but again, to me, it would be awfully good to include these types of references, if you will, in your textbook so that people can then not only understand, but also see that, I can kind of see that relationship and why it's important for me to actually want to be in the field of engineering, or why do I want to be in technology? And then, most people will know, if you know Hedy Lamarr, she was a very famous actress, but most people did not know that she actually, provided much more. She actually did a lot of work, if you will, in the technology side, and she actually actually worked on a lot of radios. She actually designs a lot of radios, and you can see on that bottom, if it wasn't for Hedy, we likely wouldn't have Wi-Fi today because of some of the things that she pioneered, right? And Stephanie Kolek, right, one of the first female research chemists, right, and she came up where she developed, if you will, right, Kevlar, which we take for granted today, right? And then, Katherine Johnson. And again, if you seen the movie that was Hidden Figures, right, this movie, she's the main character. And you can see her accolades and how, what she would, how important her work was to NASA, right? And I'll kind of give you a few more so you can kind of get a feel, right? So here's Theodore Colbert, right? He was named Black Engineer of the Year, right? Selected by the U.S. Black Engineer and Information Technology magazine. And again, another noted individual in the technical field. And then Dr. Ellen Ochoa, again, another brilliant scientist, right, that works in NASA. And you can see her comment on the bottom: I hope to continue to inspire our nation's youth to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and math, so that they too may reach for the stars. And then Peter, right, Peter Tsai, and you can see he's a Taiwanese American material scientist, and he was the one that created the N95 mask that we are now very familiar with, right? So again, sometimes as you recognize, or at least put some I'll call it, put some faces to the technology that you're talking about, I think would be very helpful to understand and kind of broaden that content a little bit. Okay. Now, I think what's also important is case studies. And a lot of times, when you're looking at technical textbooks, there's always case studies about primarily the Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. and companies or cases that we're very familiar with, I'm going to say, in the Western Hemisphere, right? But then you said, well, there's many other projects that are going on throughout the world, and if your reading audience is from that other part of the world, wouldn't it be worthwhile for you to incorporate them into your textbook so it brings in more relevance, and it's actually going to help with the definition? So For example, here's another example for you, Zapplot Solar photovoltaic plant. And this one here is in Zimbabwe, right? Again, having a case discussing this could bring in a whole lot more richer discussion, much more in a intercultural perspective, much more in a much more diverse perspective. Another one would be Zinguru. It's a hydroelectric power project. Right. Again, this one here is also is a project. I believe this one is in South Africa. But again, you can kind of see, these types of things. Right. And then this one here is, quite famous. But again, I'm thinking, gee, I wonder how many students that's reading books about construction, if you will even hear about, right, the Dragon Bridge in Da Nang, Vietnam, and how unique this bridge is. Right. So the idea of bringing these types of views, if you will, or bringing in these various projects, if you will, that are being done outside the U.S. Keep in mind, the population for graduate and doctoral students, right, and the non-resident population is well over 60%. Why would you not want to introduce some of these? Because I think this will bring in a whole and even in a classroom, it would bring in a whole lot richer discussion. I know in some of the classes that I teach, when and I do teach graduate students, when we do have discussions about projects outside the U.S., people from that region would say, "Oh, I know about that. Let me tell you more." And that's really the idea of, well, geez, why not do that in your textbook as well, right? Yeah, and a few more things, and again, here's Dubai land, right? And as you look at this is going to be like Disneyland, but much bigger, right? It's 51 Disneylands. Okay, so you can imagine what this is going to look like, and why would you not say this is a mega construction engineering project? Much larger than many of the projects that you probably haven't even heard about, right? So that's really some of the ways that, if you will, that I think would be worthwhile to consider. Next is talking about problems, right? Setting up your problems so that it's global in nature, considering the use of language, names, places, and things. And again, is the problem relevant to the reader, so that you are actually bringing in the intercultural, you're bringing in the diversity, you're bringing in the equity in how you're looking at these problems, and to, engaging or encouraging the reader to really try to solve problems, right, in a totally different way, I think, right? And then exercises, right, develop for groups or individuals where you're encouraging, what some people call immersive thinking of the others, right? What is that like, right? Challenge the conventional approach and think outside of the bell curve of, well, we're not talking about the design eye anymore. We're talking about how do we include everyone in that design eye, right? And here's an example of an exercise, right, where you find a text that you would consider technical, and working alone or as a group, answer the following: who is the target audience? Who is being left out? How does this document engage or ignore? And how would you revise this document to become considered more DEI? So again, you would do this. Sometimes I actually, would do this in the classroom. Say, okay, well, you break out in a group. Let's, you take this one here. You go find a case. You go find a project, an engineering project, and think about this and see what you come up with, right? So these would be types of exercises. And earlier on, I mentioned I did do a quick literature review. Here's the review that I did. So I thought I'd leave the references for you. So I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica and Paul. We have one question in the chat. I also wanted to mention that I saw that you have a set of website resources that are in the presentation area, I think on the on our platform so that people can download or put those in their swag bag. We have one question from Marielle in the chat, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday during a session that I was in as well. So we have some different people here today. In the accessibility review for her biology book, some of the figures were hard to fix, especially those using maps. If a map has a lot of regions with different qualities, different ecosystems across the globe, adding patterns over colors can add visual clutter that makes the map unusable by anyone. Have you found any solution for making complex maps accessible to people with visual impairments?
A couple of thoughts I had about that one, and I agree. Maps can actually be one of the most difficult figures to make, especially again, as you've mentioned, with a lot of different information to convey. They can be really difficult and they can get very cluttered very quickly. One thing, very simply, but perhaps not the best solution, is just making sure you're using colors that do have high contrast. So even if it's viewed in like perhaps a black and white version, it's clear you can see the contrast between each country or each ecosystem you're trying to represent. Another option is to use labels if that's feasible. You could also include a key that has that makes use of just smaller shapes instead of entire patterns. So for example, if you wanted to indicate, one ecosystem, you could put a square, a very small, square on those countries. You could use a triangle to represent a different ecosystem. Those are just some thoughts that come to mind. I don't know if Laura, you guys you mentioned this came up with you guys. I don't know if you have some other recommendations, or Paul, if you have any.
We were talking yesterday about, maybe just limiting the amount of information that you put on the map, like focusing in on a particular amount, a particular area, so that you would have less hashing and colors that you would need to use. That was something I thought of, but no, that's a good idea to add the labels too.
Yep, I think that would be awesome. I think that's also something, because again, I know in technical textbooks, that's always a challenge of how much information do you pack into one map or one chart or one diagram, and would it make sense to again for the readers, and so one of the things that I always try to think about is, how do I keep it simple? Number one. Number two, is the way I'm defining that map or that chart, does that make sense to the readers? Right. And if it doesn't, then wait a minute, it's not about me anymore. It's about, right, who is it that I want to really read this, and how do I make it so that it's understood by the reader? Right, because you're right. I mean, many of the diagrams and the charts and that we create in textbooks, my word, I mean, it'd take you, a couple of hours just to figure out what are you trying to say in this, right?
Jenny put another idea into the chat, you could put some information in the ancillary materials that might describe the map in more detail, like a short video that highlights the major parts of the map. That's not a bad idea either.
Yep.
Did anybody else have any questions? We have about 4 minutes left in this session. Sean put in the chat, we do have a set of resources on the TAA website under resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so one of the things we have in there is an annotated bibliography of some websites, which mirrors a little bit of what you guys talked about at the beginning with the person first language and those kinds of things. So thank you for reiterating some of that, so that folks that hadn't heard it before would then be able to hear it and maybe access some of our resources.
Laura, just a quick question.
Yes.
This is
Right.
her statement. Authors need to be aggressive. there's that soft tissue between the publisher and the author, that the author hangs back like on an issue of color blindness and colors used on maps or diagrams. The publisher steps forward in their growing level of incompetence, Peter Principle, and fills that